Hey, you're listening to Terms of Engagement, episode 15 already. My name's Archon Fung. I'm a faculty member at the Harvard Kennedy School and director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation here.
And I'm Stephen Richer. I'm the former elected Maricopa County recorder, and I am now a senior fellow at the Ash Center at Harvard Kennedy School. And of course, as always, Archon and I are speaking in our individual capacities, not on behalf of the Ash Center or not on behalf of the Harvard Kennedy School. And always, of course, we welcome your comments. And so if you have comments on today's discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll work to integrate them into the conversation.
Great. And just a little bit of an update from our last couple of episodes, episode 13 with Joey Fishkin and episode 14 with Danielle Allen. We talked about the Compact for Higher Education, which the Trump administration offered initially to 9 universities around the country. Yeah. And as the deadline that the Trump administration...
Was it last night?
It was last night. And as of last night, 7 universities indicated that they would not sign the compact. And those were MIT, Brown, University of Virginia, Dartmouth, University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Southern California. And thus far, we haven't heard from 2 more, which is the University of Texas at Austin and Vanderbilt University. Although the chancellor of Vanderbilt, according to reporting from the Times, said that they had some reservations about the compact. So on episode 13, Stephen, you asked me if several universities signed, would it make collective action more difficult for others? I said, absolutely. But what's turned out to be is the opposite of that, is 7 universities have said, no, we're not going to do it, which I think it's the first example of kind of fairly costly institutional collective action to say no to administration demands in higher ed, but maybe also in the broader landscape of foundations, media organizations, and law firms that I can think of. So I think this might be significant.
I think it's pretty awkward now if you're Vanderbilt and you try to say yes.
Yeah.
And so if Vanderbilt and University of Texas haven't responded yet, does that mean that all students can turn in assignments late, given that they've missed the deadline? Now, we should note that the Trump administration has made overtures to additional universities, including Arizona State University, brought them in for conversations with the Department of Education. So it does look like this is expanding beyond those original 9 universities. And of course, as we mentioned last week, it might soon be opened up to all universities.
Right. It may already be. The reporting on that's a little unclear, I think.
But some universities have been brought in for the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So on to today's topic, inflatable frogs and the resistance. So today we'll be talking about the No Kings protest movement. It's reported that on Saturday, there were over 2,600 events all across the United States. And I think, if you're just looking at crowds at one protest, it's often a heroic estimation. Trying to estimate thousands is very, very difficult. But people are throwing around numbers like between 5 and 8 million. I think we'll have somewhat better estimates, hopefully, in a few weeks. We'll post in the show notes in the chat some of the crowdsourcing efforts through which people are trying to estimate some of these crowd counts of very dispersed protests. And so to help us understand this weekend's protest, but also the larger resistance movement and the history of protest in the U.S., we're joined by the University of Pittsburgh's Lara Putnam.
All right. So it's my honor to introduce our guest, which is indeed Professor Lara Putnam, who is the UCIS Research Professor of History and Director of the Global Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. She researches social movements and political participation in local, national, and transnational dimensions. In recent years, Professor Putnam has used ethnographic and oral historical methods to explore shifts in grassroots politics in Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, and beyond. In addition to her academic writings, she writes for popular publications such as the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, the New Republic, Vox, and Democracy, a Journal of Ideas. She also leads the Civic Resilience Initiative at Pitt's Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security. Welcome, Professor Putnam. Welcome, Lara.
Great. So I think all 3 of us went to different No Kings protests around the country.
Yeah, but at the outset, I should say that this is unusual for me, and I'm a little bit of a protest skeptic, but I wanted to go just because it was such a historical and because I had so many friends involved in it. So I went to the one at Boston Common, which was a beautiful day. It was just delightful to be walking around downtown Boston, and there were thousands and thousands of people out and about, and it had a very festive, fun. Lots of people were doing arts and crafts. I think it was sort of like do your arts and crafts excuse for a lot of adults. You went in.
I saw the one in Times Square pretty briefly. I didn't stick around for very long because I was with friends and kind of went by and saw it. And then, Lara, which ones did you go to?
Let's see. Oh, I think we might have lost her chat. All right, so we'll see if we can bring Professor Putnam in here through a different means. But I think Professor Putnam went to a few in the Pennsylvania area, and so I guess we should probably start with just sort of the notion, what do you think the goal was?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the organizers' goals were.
So the organizers were a whole bunch of different organizations, right? There is no one organizing entity. It's not like there's no Kings.Inc. or something like that.
I think Indivisible nationally was pretty key in the organizing. I think what the protests do, a few of the things that protests do, is make it visible how many people are upset with the current administration.
So would you say that's the unifying principle, is just we were upset, and it could be, we're upset about because the cuts to the federal government. Lara, are you back with us? Can you hear us now?
I'm back with you, and now I can hear you. So thank you for your
phenomenal. Even better. Some people would prefer not to hear us. I get that occasionally.
Would pay extra for that. Yeah. But yeah. My apologies.
Well, great. Well, I read off your introduction, and we were just talking. I went to the No Kings protests in Boston, downtown Boston. Archon went in Times Square, and we were saying that we think that you had gone to 2 different protests in the Pennsylvania area.
That's right. So I started down in Fayette County, which is a county that Donald Trump won with 68% of the vote, in the city of Uniontown. So this is like an old coal-producing region in southwest Pennsylvania. And then after about an hour there, I drove up to Greensburg, Pennsylvania, in Westmoreland County, which is an area that was actually one of the real starting points of the Tea Party surge back in 2009 in response to Barack Obama's election. So I wanted to get a sense of what the protests were looking like outside of metropolitan areas.
Did they have distinct vibes?
Absolutely. It was really striking in both places. And I've been to protests actually in each of these places as well as elsewhere. These protests were just sort of demographically much strikingly more representative of just the population as a whole of these different places. So both of these are counties that are pretty white counties. There were more men. There were more a pretty wide range of ages, although mainly folks in the sort of 50 to 60 to 70 range. But there was also a lot of really strikingly in both of these places, a lot of people who sort of look like they fit that Reddit guy demographic of just regular guys kind of skeptical of the whole political system in their 30s, 40s, 50s. So that was really that. And
sorry, on your realizing that it's not scientific, what characterized the Times Square protests?
I think
The
it was
demographics.
looked to me like some of the usual suspects of people who are more politically active on the left. I thought there were fewer African-American, Black people, and Hispanics than if you just kind of walk down big parts of New York just on a regular day. It felt a little more white to me. But, I didn't do a survey or anything. I would guess because it's New York City, the vast majority did not vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah. So one of the criticisms that's been online of the various protests were that, one, I think a lot of the anticipatory criticism was that this is going to be a bunch of radical lefties. This is going to be affiliated with Antifa, and that this is going to be potentially violent, or just a bunch of people who are, kind of weird. I don't know. But instead, the criticism was that it was old, white, and not terribly cool.
Right,
I
the hippie,
thought,
right?
yeah.
Somebody said, right.
Like it was a bunch of people doing like line dancing and wearing animal costumes. Is that actually a good thing, or is that bad
is that
thing?
even what you think of who went? What are your impressions from more rural places?
Yeah, I mean, again, what was most striking to me was how reflective of the sort of population as a whole, of demographically, really in both of these places, in both the sort of more rural aging Fayette County and in Westmoreland, which is more of a blend. And so it definitely was not like, that I have not seen so many American flags in the same place since, the last 4th of July big bang and protest.
Wow.
Parade in each of these places. So it was definitely, embracing the sort of patriotic signs and symbols. It was also really striking to me, actually, that the folks driving past in cars and pickup trucks were probably like 20-1 honking in favor of the protesters, and that was different from what I've seen before. That was not what I did.
That's so interesting. Why do you think that is? And then did you manage to talk to people? Like, were they people who never supported Donald Trump, or are now having some second thoughts? Or
so I think it's unlikely that anyone who was at the protest had, voted for Donald Trump in 2024. The range of folks who are there are, I would say, demographically similar to folks who are increasingly registering independent rather than Democratic in those particular counties. Again, you can be demographically representative, but not representative in your personal views, of course. But they were broad based in the sort of demographic representation, and definitely, neither sort of simply aging hippies nor young radicals. It was just like regular folks. That was very much the vibe. There, organizers at one point had put out a call to wear yellow, sort of reminiscent of that "Don't Tread on Me" flag. And so I started looking at which kinds of yellow t-shirts people happen to have in their closets. And it was like, one was like this very natty shirt from the Pennsylvania Snowmobilers State Association. And one was like the Murraysville High School marching band, and one was a Jimmy Buffett t-shirt. It was just like a kind of regular blend of what you'd see, at the grocery store in Southwest Pennsylvania.
So I didn't know the yellow component, and I didn't see too much yellow. I will say that it warmed my sort of Americanist heart to see all the constitutional messaging, all the revolutionary rhetoric. I saw a Thomas Paine sign, and I like that. But to Lara's point, she doesn't think it was people who voted for President Trump in 2024. So if this isn't about persuading those people or mobilizing people who weren't part of the Trump coalition in 2024, what's the purpose? Is it to persuade the people who are sitting on the sidelines, or is it just to show other people that there's solidarity in dissatisfaction?
Yeah. What do you think the purposes are? Well, first of all, do you have any insight into the organizers' purposes, whether it's Indivisible or other kinds of organizations? And then what are other purposes of the protest, whether or not the organizers intended them?
Yeah. I think, it was a really broad coalition of organizations who were among the organizers. If you go to the No Kings website, all of the sort of standard sort of center-left unions, SEIU, certainly all the unions that tend to be more strongly leftist, communication workers, the UE, and Next Gen America and Planned Parenthood and the League of Conservation Voters, but also, some of the, say, Trump Resistance 1.0, Indivisible, and other, groups that popped up and became important coalitions from 2017 onward. And then some new folks, like there's been this sort of very loose coalition called 5051, 50501, which has done some organizing of protests in the since January, mainly organizing on Reddit, tends to bring in younger people, especially in metropolitan areas, may bring in people who are, explicitly not affiliated with the Democratic Party. But there's sort of one question is like, who's calling for this and then who's making it happen locally? Locally, it was often a combination of folks, but with local Democratic organizations like the Democratic Women of Fayette County and the Democratic Women of Westmoreland and the such and such a district, even sub-county local Democratic folks who were, making sure that you got the permit, that you had trained protest marshals. It was really it was very clear that organizers had even in the small city of Uniontown on up to Greensburg were very focused on making sure that there's going to be folks in charge who are going to prevent violence or who are going to be able to respond to provocations, which there didn't end up being. As I said, there were.
Yeah, I should say it was very successful, seemingly, in that respect. And Professor Chenoweth here, Erica Chenoweth, has already said that that there were very few incidents of reported violence, very few incidents of police engagement. But I want to draw you in on sort of this purpose thing, because again, I laid out my priors being a bit of a skeptic, and Jay Cave in the comments says that the point of a protest is to pressure policymakers and to draw attention to issues. So is there a particular policy that people want changed in this? Or does this have to do with the November election that is right around the corner in Virginia and New York? Or where do you think, I guess.
So I think you always have multiple different audiences, right? You've got the local audience of people who may be who are almost by definition less engaged in politics than you are. So they voted for whoever they voted, but they're not necessarily following politics closely. They may be hearing through media or social media different thoughts on how the Trump presidency is going. So as you're organizing a protest, part of your audience is whether through people actually seeing you or word of mouth, conveying your vision of your values and in this case your opposition to the current steps being taken by the current government. And there were a range of signs that were sort of issue specific. You mentioned a lot that had to do with sort of standing up for the Constitution. Those are really important values. As we know, I would say from research and recent elections, those aren't necessarily the top of mind values for swing voters, right? So actually, if you're out there caring about the rule of law and the Constitution, you're already kind of unusual statistically in the United States, and swinging you is not going to actually swing an election. So there were a lot of signs, I think, very intentionally that were about things like protecting Medicaid, about Social Security, about the ACA benefits and subsidies, so healthcare, about taxes and billionaires. And so there's, policy-specific signs. Also a lot of, I would say, anti-ICE signs. I would say the images of,
I did see a lot of
immigration.
And the specifics of like, raids in America's cities and the military, sending the National Guard to America's cities. That like immigration encompasses a whole bunch of things, but that piece of how it's being handled is clearly not popular among protesters. But so they're like the people you might be able to persuade to get off the sidelines enough to, let's say, vote in an upcoming election they might otherwise not have voted in. Right? So there's that piece of it.
So elections do loom as part of this, whether it's the elections that are coming up in just a few weeks here, or whether it's the elections in 2026. Yeah. How much do you think that getting people to vote in a certain way is the motivation?
I think it was somewhat less that. A couple of purposes I think this protest and many others serve. One is to let other people know that you care. So some of the research on non-democratic situations show that people underestimate how much other people don't like the regime because it's quiet. Nobody's you can't it's hard to infer what people are really thinking. And a protest is a manifestation of what people are thinking. To me, I don't know if any of the organizers thought this, but to me, one of the main values of this protest is exercising muscles. So if the 2026 election goes bad in the sense of a January 6th type of scenario of undermining the election, I think popular protest is one of the main things that might put it back on track. And so this is maybe an on-ramp toward that kind of muscle. Now, Adam Chervorsky, the political scientist, in his Substack post from yesterday, he went to the one in Times Square, and he said he was struck by how little capital E Democratic messaging there was. It wasn't like vote for the opposition to this party. And so I'm wondering, like, I found that a striking observation. I think it's probably correct because a bunch of the people that you're drawing in are pretty skeptical of the capital E Democratic Party. So I wonder, like, Lara, how much electoral politics do you think was in there? I must say, in the Boston one, which I didn't go to, the speakers were Mayor Michelle Wu, Attorney General Andrea Campbell.
But honestly, like, I didn't even know where they were. I didn't hear them. And it was more just about, like, seeing people's signs. And, like, there were different parts and seeing people's costumes and whatnot. But,
it wasn't I mean, to what extent is it a capital E Democratic kind of activity that happened on Saturday, do you think?
Yeah, but the thing is, like, strikingly, in order to have an electoral impact, it doesn't have to have capital D branding, and it may in fact be most impactful because those swing voters are the people who are least, like, by definition, the swing voters are the people who are least all in on the Democratic Party branding. So it may well be that mobilizing people and saying, you're part of this us that doesn't necessarily have a capital D Democrat by its name, that may be the most impactful. I mean, I would say there's, there's a lot of evidence that there is an electoral impact to having protests. Folks have done studies both for the Tea Party protests, for the Women's March, and for the Black Lives Matter protests, looking at rainfall. So basically saying, let's compare places where protests were rained out, so they didn't happen, whether or not people intended to. They couldn't happen because of rainfall, to places where there wasn't a rainfall, and on that day there was, and so protests could move forward. And all of the statistical analysis of that suggests that actually the fact of having been good weather so that you could go out and actually protest does reverberate into increased vote share for the party that's sort of aligned with the protesters in the next election. Although it seems to be pretty heterogeneous, so that, for instance, for the Black Lives Matter protests, it seems like the biggest impact came in the whitest places. So when you had sort of more like less diverse places where you had a racial justice protest, that translated into, and that wasn't rained out, that translated into more votes for Joe Biden in November 2020. So it's interesting. So and the other route through which that happens, we've already talked about, sort of showing that there's support for the views that the protesters are standing up for, but also just meeting people at a protest matters, right? So people who go to a protest meet other people, establish connections, the local organizers, not the national coalition, build their email list. And so sort of formally growing groups that then can pull people in as volunteers on local races and so on in ways that reverberates outward.
So the unifying principle of all of this, the unifying personality of all of this, and obviously the alleged king in the No Kings protest is President Donald Trump, and objecting to the policies, the personality, whatever it is of President Trump. Now, in response, the White House only said something about, like, no big deal, or it was silly or something like that. But also, President Trump posted a video to social media, and we were gonna show that if we can. So I don't know if Colette or Sarah is able to put that up. From Top Gun.
From Top Gun, yeah.
So
now we're moving from the protest, like how to understand the protest in itself, to the protest in the larger American narrative, which this is engaging.
Yeah. And so given that President Trump responded how he did, he clearly wasn't, I guess, shaking in his boots. What was this successful? Was this meant to change? Was this meant to cow President Trump?
And what do you make of that response?
What I have no idea what, I mean, I'm saying, like, how would we know if he was shaking in his boots? I'm gonna say it's not clear to me whether how Trump or Trump's allies in the government are feeling about this, and it's not clear to me whether, and this may be the more important question, whether Republican Congress people who are up for election, a year and a month from now, having seen there being multiple protests held with, hundreds to thousands of people held within their own districts, does this shift their calculation at the margins moving forwards? I think that's the more relevant question. It's much more about less about the perceptions of Donald Trump, who's going to do what he's going to do, and more about the self-interested perceptions of folks and and folks who be on the ballot in the year ahead. And the fact of that, it's less the number of people who showed up in New York City or even Boston, and more just the spread of how many different places. I mean, in Pennsylvania alone, there were over 80 different separate communities that held protests, and just the fact of that local protest, and also its coverage in the local media is more relevant in terms of national politics, because what the Congress chooses to do or not do in terms of Donald Trump is super important. So, if a congressperson knows that there have been five different communities in his own district there have been enough people who felt strongly enough that they showed up to protest, that may reverberate through that route, which wouldn't necessarily show up in Donald Trump's choice of video to post.
Right. I guess to my mind, I mean, one reason why we showed that is I think it's an effort to shape what a protest is and how to think about it, right? Because all these protests from Black Lives Matter I think, harken back to the dignified protests of the civil rights movement in some way. And then when Speaker Mike Johnson says, well, what's going to happen on Saturday is the people who hate America and the fascists and the pro-Hamas wing of the Democratic Party, which is to say the whole Democratic Party, he's trying to say, no, it's not the dignified activity of the civil rights marchers. It's these anarchists and rabble rousers. And then I think Donald Trump's video is saying something different still. It's like, I don't care who these people are, but they're not us. And so, where Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake, Donald Trump is saying, let them eat something else. Yeah. And so that's one effort to characterize. But with 5051 and Indivisible, what do you think? How do you think they're trying to characterize what this protest is about? It's not a march on Washington. It's everywhere. And it's a bunch of other things also.
No, I mean, just, one point on, Donald Trump had to go make an AI generated video of himself with the plane because there wasn't any useful to him footage being generated by the protest, right? So in some way, read that,
there's no Molotov cocktail.
There was no Molotov cocktail.
Yeah. Los Angeles was so easy to show people on top of burned out Waymos waving a Palestinian flag and just retweet that. This time, that's a great point. That is a great point. Yeah.
So I think, in the first do no harm, it's incredibly impressive that you managed to get 7 million people into the streets to participate in protests and not generate a single clip that could go viral, much less a highlight reel that would match that the narrative that they had preset in place. They hate America. It's the violent communists. It's the Hamas wing of the Democratic Party, et cetera. They had geared up a whole narrative frame and then didn't have anything to put in it. So then they shifted gears, and you can see the sort of narrative flailing there.
So I think by the rubric of no unforced errors, this will go down as one of the largest mobilizations in United States history.
Maybe the largest single day.
Maybe the largest single day. No countervailing narrative that sets up easily. Then by that rubric, it's a success. Now, one of the things that I was reading about with respect to some of the costumes is that this was supposed to be fun. This was supposed to be inviting. Did you have fun?
I would have had fun if I'd stayed longer. I thought it was pretty joyful, right? I mean, the inflatable animals and
is that important to because I never looked at like Selma, Alabama, crossing the bridge as like these people obviously weren't having fun, but they were also being attacked.
But I mean, I think that drawing, it is one thing to prepare a protest movement to intentionally use protest or nonviolence to attract violence in order to shape the media narrative and impact policymakers elsewhere. And that's what the sort of heroic phase of the civil rights movement did. But that doesn't just happen. And for sure, and you say sort of no unforced errors, you for sure do not want to be pulling people who have not been through like deep building processes of, solidarity and training and preparation to be sort of cannon fodder into a world in which any slip from the sort of dignified, we are going to put our bodies on the line and accept and be the recipients of violence in order to shift the narrative. It would have been, I think, a huge strategic error to be aiming for that, and no one was aiming for that this time, and reasonably so. So in terms of like making it fun, I think the crucial thing is to make it feel like safe and inviting, and like a space that you could identify yourself, people who are less political can identify with and can see themselves stepping forward into, right? So that it doesn't seem like a space of where only radicals, or where I'm going to end up, on social media next to a sign that says something egregious that I don't believe in, or so the fact of bringing the temperature down through funny signs and through costumes. There were a lot of Portland frogs on display in Westmoreland County. So, that I think is both important for avoiding bad outcomes in the present, and also in setting up the possibility of being like, and sending the message, we could do this again. That we didn't bear risk, or this was not costly to the participants in a way that would make folks think that this is, they're never going to do that again.
So speaking of which, is there another protest already?
Yeah, and more broadly, maybe the last kind of thing we can explore is, where do you think this is going? Is there going to be more No Kings, or will these people all join organizations and deepen their activism, or where do you think it's going?
So for sure, we know from past experiences that folks who do one thing tend to show up at the next thing. And we know from interesting studies done like in 2018 that even if you just compare people who were politically active to people who were politically active and went to rallies, right? So the people who had participated in rallies were like twice as likely to be planning to volunteer in the midterm election for a candidate. So, rather than 16% of people who were politically active in whatever way but not attending, versus 38%, I want to say, among people who had gone to a protest or a rally. So for sure, I think that the protest to political volunteer, pipeline is like well established as something that we should, I think, expect to see.
Okay. Well, speaking of next things, though, because I see we're at our time, so we do have our next. We have our next thing scheduled, which is next week, a week from now, and we hope that you'll join us again. And then I just wanted to say, our 30 minutes has come, and I did want to say thank you so much to Professor Lara Putnam from University of Pittsburgh. And any closing thoughts?
Let me add my thanks as well for sharing your wisdom and your direct observation of places that are neither Boston Common nor Times Square is super interesting and important. And to folks out there who are watching or listening, if you have suggestions or themes that you'd like us to explore, please email info@ash.harvard.edu. And huge thanks to Sarah and Colette and Courtney for making the whole program work. And I hope to see you next week.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. It's been fun.
Great. Thank you very much.